How's everybody doing? It came to my attention last week, pretty interesting thing. There was a video that was on YouTube. It's been since removed from YouTube. It was up and was actually shown in a classroom in Rockland County, New York, a little town, Clarkstown. Now it's interesting that this particular video should be shown there in Rockland County because there is a lot of political controversy, people don't know, between the Orthodox community and the nearby community and general community. It's not really affecting Clarkstown in particular, but it's interesting how close that is there. It was shown in a history class, a 9th grade history class in the public school there. It came from a particular website. I'm not going to mention the name of the website. People can look it up and find out. The ADL came out with a statement. The website, to their credit, did remove the video, and YouTube also removed the video. And the ADL, not that I'm the biggest supporter of everything the ADL stands for, they said that this video was anti-Semitic and it brought up negative stereotypes about Jews. A lot of people were offended by it. People in the Orthodox community were offended when we heard about it. But what's really offensive about the video? I mean, it's a good question. And so let's first talk about people. Many people probably didn't see the video, don't have the opportunity to see it. Because really, to me, although I did find it offensive and I found it to be inaccurate for the most part, it was still thought-provoking. And we have to understand, well, what was offensive about it? Why was it offensive? What was inaccurate about it? All these things are good to talk about. Now, one thing was, we'll just talk about what the video spoke about. Now, the video mentioned that it was talking about the differences between Judaism and Christianity in ancient Rome, and how Christianity developed as a major religion, which starting off as basically a small Jewish sect, or could even be called a Jewish cult, and developing into the #1 world religion. And what were the differences and similarities, and why, according to this particular teacher who was presenting this, he said that basically Judaism had failed and Christianity had succeeded, and why. And the way he painted it was basically Judaism was a religion that was linked without any inabrogably from the culture, from the language, from the land, and to the race of the Jewish race, as opposed to Christianity, which was a message for all races, for all nations, and wasn't linked to a particular piece of land or a particular language or culture. And first of all, that's not really true. And even he went into the details of it. He said, the Jews, they had their own language. They spoke Hebrew, and which was not true. And we'll get to that. And that, whereas Christians spoke Greek and so forth, and Jews were just seeking to protect this one land, and the Christians spread their message throughout the empire. And the other thing the video claimed was, which was probably more shocking, which, there's been a lot of buzz about this on Twitter and other websites, and no one that I could see really touched on the end of the video, which to me was the most shocking part of the whole video. At the end of the video, they said that we could compare the Jews who kept, the Jews, they kept to themselves. They only cared about one particular race, and therefore anyone who heard what happened, the persecution of the Jews, the video said, well, this is what was coming to them, and nobody really cared because they were aloof from the rest of society, as opposed to Christians who were involved and integrated and assimilated into the society, and therefore people did care, and that's how their message spread. And this particular teacher who was teaching in this video, compared it to the civil rights movement in the United States, particularly in the 1950s and 60s. And the two different views, maybe you want to take care of the baby, give him the bati or something. And he compared it to two different groups, that of Malcolm X and that of Martin Luther King. And that he's basically said, this teacher, that the Jews were like Malcolm X, that they only cared about one race, just like Malcolm X only cared about the blacks and wasn't seeking peace, and that when he was eventually assassinated, he got what was coming to him, most people would say. I don't know, let's look around. Or just, play with him, or give him and that when Martin Luther King was assassinated, inasmuch that he was looking for a message of peace for all races and wasn't caring only about his own race, everyone was shocked about what he had to say. And so therefore, when Malcolm X was assassinated, people said, oh, he got what was coming to him, and no one was shocked, and really put an end to his movement, as opposed to Martin Luther King, that his movement went on after his assassination and really got stronger because of the assassination in a certain sense. Now, there's a lot of things to reflect on in this particular video. Now, first of all, there's the other falsehoods of what this particular teacher was teaching in this video. One was that just a major glaring falsehood that he brought up was that Jews spoke only Hebrew. The fact of the matter was, in Roman times, and really since the Babylonian times, the Jews did not speak Hebrew. And according to many of the Jewish traditions that we have, that Jews never spoke Hebrew as a national language. Maybe you want to take him out and I'll hold him? I don't know. That the Jews spoke as a secular spoken language, the lingua franca, certainly in the times of the Roman era and in the times preceding that. All right, so take the language that they spoke was Aramaic, maybe, and not Hebrew. Hebrew was, as today among pious Jews, reserved only for prayer and study of scripture, and that's it. It was not a spoken language, and so in those days they spoke Aramaic. Today many pious Jews will speak Yiddish among themselves, or at one time it would be Ladino or other language. There's a Jewish version of Farsi that the Persian Iranian Jews speak, which is different than the regular Farsi. And so they did not speak Hebrew at all. That was not a spoken language. And the fact was, many Jews did speak Greek, if not most Jews. Recently, there was in Tziporia in the Galilee, there was discovered some tombs of rabbis. They're not exactly sure who the rabbis were, a Rabbi Yossi and others. And on the tombs that the archaeologists discovered were writings, inscriptions, both in Aramaic and in Greek. And the rabbis actually said that a Torah written in Greek was technically kosher, which is pretty shocking. So the claim that the Jews did not speak Greek but rather only spoke Hebrew is patently false. Not only did they speak Greek, but their language was not Hebrew at all. Their Jewish language that they spoke among themselves was Aramaic. It was a Jewish style of Aramaic. It was written in Hebrew letters, but it was, or Assyrian script, what we call now Hebrew. But it was it was not Hebrew. They didn't speak Hebrew. So, in many ways, what I remember hearing in high school, one of my rabbis, Moshe Weinberg, a very popular speaker now, he said, when he opens up the New York Times and he reads an article about Jews, and he knows that whatever's in the article is false, so he can assume, because he knows about Judaism, he knows about Jews, so you can assume the same, that when the New York Times reports about Buddhists or Hindus or Sikhs or Christians, Muslims, whatever it is, that he knows less about those groups, he would assume that the New York Times is making a mistake there. They just don't know what they're talking about. Now, that's rather specious, particularly because there is an agenda, there has for a long time been an agenda against Judaism and against Jews, but more against Judaism than against Jews, really, it should be noted. But that's really, we could say that just the simple fact that this man claiming to be a history teacher makes a very basic mistake that everybody knows is wrong, that claiming that the Jews in Roman times spoke Hebrew, and then he, labeled consequences to it that, it shows that they didn't care about anybody else, which is just also patently wrong. The next part was that he said, again, they were aloof from society, they were only concerned about one race, they were not concerned about spreading the message. Now, I can understand where he would get this idea, because in the modern day, Jews in general do not proselytize. There are some, notably, what's the fellow's name? He's a radio host. What's the guy's name with the white hair? Dennis Prager. Dennis Prager has suggested that Jews should engage in proselytizing, and he brought from a friend of his, Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, the fact that there is no prohibition in Judaism against proselytizing. The fact was, the reason Jews stopped proselytizing was because it was dangerous. And because of the persecution that Jews faced, they would not proselytize, because the convert generally would be killed, as happened even into more recent times, let's say in the 1700s in Lithuania. There was a very famous case, there was a very famous count, Graf Petoskey, who converted to Judaism and was burned at the stake for it. He was a nobleman in Lithuania, and he was burned at the stake for converting to Judaism. And it's a very famous story, and his ashes are actually buried together with the holy Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, the Vilna Gaon, one of the holiest and most famous rabbis in the postmodern, in the post-medieval era, and really of all history. Now, although there was an idea, and always has been an idea, that when someone converts, we should see what their intentions are and ask them why they want to do it and so forth. But the fact was that in ancient Roman times, there was a very strong movement of proselytizing among Jews. There was a whole group, the Idumeans, who were actually forcibly converted to Judaism. That's the only time I really know in history that Jews forcibly converted a whole group. Although we know the Khazars also was another small group later in history, in the medieval times, who also converted to Judaism. There's all kinds of conspiracy theories that today's Jews are not, quote-unquote, the real Jews, because they are, in fact, Khazars. First of all, it's not even true, because the Khazars are not the entirety of the Ashkenazic Jewish community, as has been proven from genetic testing. But even if it were true, they are real Jews, because they did convert. It doesn't matter. Judaism is not a race. It is a religion. And so if they converted to the religion, they are Jews. That's just like, any other religion. When you convert to religion, you are part of that religion, and it's ridiculous to say that somehow they're not the true Jews because they're descended from converts. They are. And furthermore, we do have the lineage. I'm sure the Khazars came in and mixed together. And so I'm not saying there is no Khazar ancestry among many Ashkenazic Jews, but just the same, we know we have established lineages of priests going back to Aaron, and there are many priests in the Jewish community, meaning Kohanim, people who are descended direct, son after son, father to son, all the way to Aaron, the brother of Moses, and it's been proven genetically on the Y chromosome how all over the world, Ashkenazic, Sephardic, so forth, they all have this same marker on the Y chromosome, which is not that important right now to talk about, but it's noteworthy. But the point of why I'm bringing this up is that, no, Jews were not aloof from society. Jews, at certain parts of history, particularly in the ancient Roman times, actually were actively proselytizing, and that even in the times, and that was, although that was very rare, but they always were seeking to share their faith, and they were always seeking to and they were always accepting of converts from any religion. And the fact was, in ancient Rome, Judaism was a very popular religion, and many Romans who were dissatisfied with the pagan culture around them did convert to Judaism. That's a historical fact. It's well documented. And so the question is, well, why in the end did Christianity win? And there is a historical reason for that, and it's a very simple one. And really it came down, when you read, particularly in the book of Acts, and also in the epistles of Paul, it came down to an argument that went on in the early church. And this is what even is reflected on. Many rabbis have, commented on this, notably Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the Holy Yavitz, one of the great rabbis in the 1500s, in the 1600s, commented on this, interestingly, on this passage in the Christian Bible, in the book of Acts, where there was an argument between Paul and other members of the early church. And what the book of Acts reflects on is whether or not believers in Jesus, who, the early church, the early Christians, were required to be circumcised. And what does that mean? Really means, were they required to convert to Judaism in order to become Christians? It sounds crazy to us these days, but in those days it was like that. And Paul writes, of course, is well known in his epistle to the church in Galatia, the book of Galatians, that he was opposed to, as is recorded in the book of Acts, this idea of Gentile believers in Jesus, the early Christians, becoming circumcised, meaning he said basically, you can stay Gentiles, you don't have to convert to Judaism in order to follow Jesus. That was, what the belief was in the early days among many of the church. So why was that? Well, that reflects on the fact that, indeed, Jews in general, did welcome and encourage conversion to Judaism if someone wanted to follow. And even, Paul writes there that if you get circumcised, you're bound by the whole law. Meaning, if you convert to Judaism, you have to live like a Jew. You have to follow Judaism. You have to keep the Sabbath and kosher and so forth, as opposed to if you don't convert to Judaism. So, just as, Paul grew up among the rabbis, just as Lahavdil, we say in Judaism that someone can believe in the Jewish religion without converting to Judaism. Nowadays they call it the Noahide movement, that people who do not convert to Judaism but believe as a religion, but share the faith in the Torah that the Jews share, and obviously they're not Christians. They're not, they don't believe in Jesus, just like Orthodox Jews don't believe in Jesus. Many of them are former Christians, and yet the Jewish tradition requires Gentiles to follow a basic moral code, what we call the 7 laws of Noah, that the tradition says was originally given to Adam, and there are scriptural sources for this as well. And so that really didn't take off as a movement, and really was never intended to. It was always considered that the best thing for someone who believes in Judaism to do is to convert to Judaism, and not to simply remain as a Noahide. Nowadays, basically, it started off because of persecution. That's why things changed. But now, we don't. That's basically, most people get told when they want to convert to Judaism, well, you have 2 choices. You can convert to Judaism, or you can remain as a Noahide. Some rabbis will encourage people to remain as a Noahide. That's not really doctrinally sound. It's not really from the Talmudic standpoint. Really, it's just the opposite. The Talmud says when you see someone who is sincere, you should encourage them to convert. It is considered in Judaism a positive thing to convert. And that's basic in the Talmud, that the whole thing is to see if someone's sincere or not, or if they have some ulterior political motive or something, or that's not religiously inclined. Because if they're not sincere, they're not really going to keep it. And so to accept a burden upon themselves that they don't have any intention of keeping is, of course, a foolish thing. But if they do intend to keep it, it is certainly the best choice for someone to make, according to the rabbis of the Talmud. Now, back to our discussion of this video. So we basically knocked out 2 of the ideas that this video said, that the Jews were only caring about other Jews. They didn't care about Gentiles. They only spoke Hebrew, which is totally not true. They didn't even speak Hebrew. Many Jews didn't understand Hebrew. They might have read it for their prayers and did not really understand it, just like today. Many Jews don't really understand Hebrew, but they could read it and pray in Hebrew without really understanding what they're saying. Ideally, they should understand it, but still, pious Jews, for the most part, it's changed recently because of this modern movement of Hebrew, which really is where all these ideas that this man came up with came from. Not from the actual history of what happened in ancient Rome, but what unfortunately happening today is many Jews have left Judaism, have adopted secularism and secular nationalism, which has been, unfortunately linked with racism, and tied into racism, unfortunately. But that's because they left the religion. It's not because of the ideas of the religion. And also just the idea of the land. What was the purpose of the Holy Land? Well, the Talmud says the reason the Holy Land is holy is because of the sacrifices that are brought from it, the Bikurim, the first fruits that would be brought on the holiday of Pentecost, the Shtei Alechem, and the Omer, these offerings, grain offerings that were brought in Passover and Pentecost, which you would not bring from other lands, meaning it was a religious devotion. It wasn't a cultural, like the way that the modern day secular nationalists and even some religious nationalists have fetishized the land into almost idolatry, if not outright idolatry, and certainly heresy. Now, the movement, that's the next thing. So why was, many rabbis pointed out, so why was there this connection to this Holy Land, because the Holy Land is a centrally located area that if people were traveling to different continents, Europe, Africa, Asia, they would pass through the Holy Land. And so this was the crossroads of the world, Jerusalem, and so people, pagans who would pass through, would come by this place and see what's going on here and learn the lesson, just like Isaiah said, to be a light unto the nations, just like Moses said in Exodus 19, that the job of Israel was to be a kingdom of priests in the holy nation in order to spread this message to the whole world, not to be aloof, as this teacher said. Also, in addition just to the downright offensive nature of this comparison to Malcolm X, and nothing against Dr. Martin Luther King. I remember I was a prison chaplain in Virginia, and I met a man who was ironically from the Nation of Islam, and a very sweet man, very nice man, not at all what you would stereotypically think of the Nation of Islam. And he said that Dr. Martin Luther King was the words he used was the most Christ-like figure that he could think of in the 20th century. And I can understand that narrative also in light of this message, the same thing which is being brought. So I'm not trying to put down Christianity here. The question, just before we get to this point, so why was Christianity more successful? Back to what Paul said, because he did not insist on circumcision. And so for the most part, most of the people who converted to Judaism in ancient Rome were women, and the men, for the most part, didn't want to get circumcised, and so that was kind of a stumbling block to prevent, because Judaism does require circumcision for conversion. And that's the reason, really, the main reason why Christianity was more successful in ancient Rome and became a major world religion, and Judaism remained small, although it didn't die out altogether, because of circumcision. That's really the main reason why so many people did not convert to Judaism. Many women did, because of course women did not have to be circumcised, and that's the thing. Now back to this comparison to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and so forth. Now the fact of the matter is, Malcolm X was not killed, was not assassinated because of his racism. He was assassinated, history knows. So it shows again the ignorance of this teacher, the really shocking ignorance. Malcolm X, although many people might have said, oh, he deserved it because he was a racist earlier, but at the time he was assassinated, and the reason for his assassination was because he gave up his racism and he adopted mainstream Islam, which is not racist as much as the Nation of Islam that he was a part of earlier. And so, and that was the reason why he was assassinated, was because he abandoned the racist ideas of the Nation of Islam in favor of the non-racist ideas of traditional Islam. And so the whole thing that he's saying here is totally ridiculous. Now, where does this idea come from, though? Let's talk about this now. How does he come up with this idea that, because the fact of the matter is today, many Jews, particularly secular Jews, are, and particularly secular nationalist Jews, aren't, otherwise known as the Zionists, particularly secular Zionists, are more or less, although it's a small group and it's not as big, it's not the whole country of Israel that we know today. Most Israelis today are not Zionists in the traditional old-fashioned sense, and Zionism has really, we live in a post-Zionist era today. But really, the ancient the ancient Jews, there were in Roman times, as is well known, different sects just like we have today, and so if anything, the I can understand where this teacher got this idea, because today's Zionists, they do speak Hebrew. They are focused on one religion, on one land. They're not so religious, if they are at all, and they speak Hebrew. And so all these things that he said is true about the modern day secular Zionists. And for the most part, they're just focused on their own group. It's not really a racial group, although the thing is, if you're secular and you don't believe in religion, you can't convert to a race or a nation, really, without converting to religion. So if they're not religious, they are really almost, by virtue of their definition, racist. But that's not Judaism. Judaism is not racist. Judaism accepts converts from all races. It's just that these people whose ancestors did follow Judaism have abandoned Judaism, and the Jewish religion might identify many of them as Jews, but their religion is for sure not Judaism, because they're not religious at all. And many of them are atheists, agnostics, and so forth. Now, in ancient Roman times, there were Jews like this. There were, for example, the Sadducees, who were a group that abandoned the traditions of Judaism and said solo scriptura. They only believed in scripture, and these were mostly the priests, and they were dedicated more to the land and to the temple. And once the temple was destroyed, their religion vanished, as opposed to authentic Judaism as we have today. What we call Orthodox Judaism continued, or Rabbinical Judaism many call it, continued because of the fact that because it was not dependent on the land. It could exist independently of the land, and so that's why the Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when he came to the Emperor Vespasian, he didn't say, "Give me the temple." He didn't say, "Give me." He didn't say, "Give me Jerusalem." He said, "Give me Yavne and its sages," because he wanted to keep the religion alive, not the nation, not the nationalism. And so therefore, you want to take the baby? And so therefore, you put him back in his seat. His seat's in the back. So therefore, there is a certain amount of truth to what this teacher said about the aloofness and the racial aspect and so forth, but that's not talking about those who remain true to Judaism. That's talking about certain, and he also mentioned the Zealots and how violent the Jews were in ancient Rome. The fact of the matter, of what I've understood from various scholars, many said that the ancient Zealots, like we know Masada and so forth, were in fact more close to the early church. I mean, Jesus, before his crucifixion, even in the Gospels, made sure that his disciples were armed. They were not the peaceful hippies that people think. They were, in fact, a violent early sect. And we read, Jesus, he came into the temple and turned over the tables and let out the animals. He was a violent person. He said in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, he did not come to bring peace, but rather to bring the sword. And so from scripture, from the Christian scripture, of course I'm not a Christian, I don't accept that as scriptural, but from the Christian scripture we see that there was a message of violence in the early church. It was not a message of peace, and many scholars have suggested that these early zealots were in fact members of the early church. We read in the Talmud about how Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai escaped Jerusalem in order to save Judaism from being destroyed, and how he did save Judaism as the temple was being destroyed. And it's said that the Zealots came, the Barionites came and tried to prevent anyone from leaving Jerusalem. So really, historically, there's what to say that the early church was actually the violent zealots that this particular teacher was ascribing to the Jews. And of course they were Jews, but Christianity did change, of course, although it never really totally abandoned until recent times the violent nature. There were many wars throughout history waged in the name of Christianity, the Crusades, and the Inquisition was not a war, but it was very violent, and there were various wars between Protestants and Catholics. Even to today, we see in Northern Ireland and other places. So it's not really true, even historically, all these things what he's saying. Again, I'm not saying this to put down Christianity. Christianity has done great things. It has spread the Jewish Bible throughout the world. Really, Maimonides says, to pave the way for when the real Messiah comes, it won't be such a surprise. But these suggestions, again, why we can, what is so offensive about this teaching is for the most part, as certainly when we talk about Judaism as a faith, which is a religion of peace, which is a religion that transcends national borders, transcends language, transcends all these things that he's claiming are the aloofness of the Jewish faith. All those things are false as far as the Jewish religion goes. As far as people of other sects that are Jews that have left Judaism, and really it's ironic that the ADL should condemn this video, because they stand for many of these things, many of these ideas, this redefining of Jews away from Judaism, that unfortunately are true. But when we talk about Judaism as a faith, it is totally untrue. And although very few Jews actually follow Judaism as a faith, and that's what's so offensive about this video. And so the comparison that he may be true about certain aspects, certain parts of the Jewish community, but it does not reflect Judaism as a faith. And I know I spoke way too long. Maybe you guys have comments, questions, rebuttals, because yes, the fact is, even those Jews who have adopted these forms of secular nationalism and so forth are not by any means totally aloof from the world. There is tremendous humanitarian work done by the secular Jewish community, which is rooted in the Jewish tradition and transcends all nations, all borders, all religions. I mean, the truth is, there is not this aloofness. The first people to come to aid when there's something going on in Africa or Asia or somewhere in the world, who are the first ones to come to aid are Israel. And so they do maintain certain aspects of the Jewish tradition, and in a very noble way, and I have tremendous respect for that. And so really, even for that reason, I could say that certainly this idea of aloofness would be offensive really to any Jew. And also the fact is, even the Jews who do speak Hebrew among themselves generally do speak another language. Most Israelis do know English, which is the equivalent of what Greek was in the ancient times as an international language. And other ideas. So really, ultimately, it's not really true anything that this fellow said in this video, even about aspects where it might be somewhat true, and that's where it might have been misinterpreted. But certainly from the Torah true, authentically pious community, it's absolutely false, because all of these ideas, and of course there's the historical inaccuracies that he mentioned. Speaking Hebrew was not true. It's true today, but it's not true then. and this comparison to Malcolm X is also totally, although it might be a perception. And the thing is, a lot of these things are perceptions that people have, but they're based on falsehoods. So I just want to share that, and sorry I spoke so long, and thank you all for your time, and God bless. Be well. And if you have any questions, please comment. Please, if you like the video, like it, share it, subscribe to our channel. We really appreciate it. We want to really interact with our audience, and so please bring questions, and if you have some idea you want a video, particularly like you might have some questions you might want us to make a video about in the future, please feel free to reach out to us. Well, thank you very much, and God bless, and we'll see you all next time.